The Secret Story of Hin. Chapter 16. The Arkeme. The word Arkeme, a noun, derived from the ancient language of the Gada tribes, where every word was carved from survival, and every syllable bore the weight of the dead. Ark, a path, a journey, a trajectory laid not by the traveler, but by the blood that birthed them. Een, to stand, to fight, to endure beyond the breaking point, to plant one's spirit into the earth, and to refuse surrender. An Arkeme is one who walks the path of endurance, the unyielding traveler, chosen not by desire but by ancestral command. Their road is not their own, it is the inheritance of wounds, the decree of the forgotten, the burden of the weak whose cries still burn in their veins. The trajectory of the Arkeme can only be stopped when the ancestors themselves call them home, or when the earth itself shatters beneath their steps. As it is written, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not." 1 Samuel 15:2-3. The Arkeme walks in the Spirit, not in mercy but in memory, not for vengeance alone, but because memory demands blood to speak where words were stolen. The night was young, but for him there would be no rest. Not yet, not until every last chain had been shattered, every last soul freed from the hell he had once known. Hin sat at the edge of the firelight, sharpening his blade with slow, deliberate strokes. Sparks danced with every pass, tiny embers rising like spirits into the night. Around him, the newly freed moved like ghosts, their faces torn between exhaustion and the fragile hope of tomorrow. They whispered his name. They watched him, some with awe, some with fear. To them, he was no man, he was legend. He was God's will made in the flesh. The night pulsed alive and defiant, laughter tangled with the hum of music, voices lifted in song, and glasses met with the quiet certainty of survival. Camarón, Mexico, was no longer a refuge. It was a kingdom built by the unbroken. Once hunted, they had seized fate by the throat, carving freedom from the wild with blood, sweat, and fire. The land bore their scars, the air carried their stories, and the night itself sang their triumph. But Hin couldn't stay. Victory was a fleeting ghost, its taste still bitter on his tongue. Freedom had burned through his veins like fire, but there was no time to savor it. More were waiting, more were suffering, more needed him. The plantations spread like a plague, their roots tangled in the marrow of the dead, their fields soaked in blood. 7 had fallen to the fire, but hundreds more loomed, standing defiantly, their masters drunk on power, their overseers sharpening their whips. He had sworn an oath, to the dying, to the broken, to those who still dared to whisper into the night, their prayers swallowed by the darkness. He was coming for them, and Hin did not break promises. Ida knew it before he spoke. She stood over him, arms crossed, watching his hands move over the blade. "You ain't stayin', are you?" Not a question, not any more. He shook his head. Didn't think so. She didn't cry, didn't beg, just turned and walked, shoulders trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of loving a man already halfway gone. Potwal was already there, kneeling beside him with needle in hand, a bowl of ash and vinegar in the other. She worked without ceremony, jabbing the needle deep into the slash across his ribs. Blood oozed dark and defiant. "You always wait till you half dead to come see me," she muttered. He winced, but not from pain. "I didn't come to be fixed." She kept stitching, fast, brutal, every knot a curse, every pull a memory. "This ain't fixing. This is sewing up the devil's coat so he can keep walking through hell like he owned it." Hin stayed silent. "How long this time?" He didn't answer. She moved to the next wound, his shoulder, her fingers slick with blood. "You going back, ain't you, to that shithole of America? Aren't you?" Hin said nothing. She tied the thread tight to tight, and finally looked him in the eye. "Then don't die on me. Not till it's done." Each stitch was a promise. One more fight, one more mile, one more day cheated from death. Just a few nights later, Hin's voice was steady, but it carried the weight of a grave. The words spoken didn't just hang in the air, they sank heavy into the dirt beneath them. Tomorrow morning, I go back to their America." Marcus said nothing. He never did. Instead, he handed him a battered satchel, stitched from the scraps of old lives, animal hide worn soft by years of rain, blood, and hard travel. The weight of it settled against his palm like a covenant, heavy with more than just provisions. It was the weight of duty, the weight of memory, the weight of promises made to those who would never see them fulfilled. No questions, no pleas to stay, just a nod, the silent communion of men who had already buried too much to waste words on hope. Their eyes met in the smoky half-light, and in that moment passed an understanding older than language itself. They both knew what waited beyond the thinning veil of night. The moon hung high, pale and watchful, as Im stood at the camp's edge, staring north, toward the land of chains. Not just a country but an abattoir disguised as paradise. The land of chains and lash, of men who wrote freedom into parchment with one hand while gripping the whip with the other. A nation founded on the lie of liberty, where the Constitution itself protected the ownership of flesh and called it civilization, where masters slept safe in beds stuffed with cotton plucked by black hands that would never know rest. Freedom wasn't handed down like the mercy of kings. It wasn't granted in legislation or pronounced from pulpits. It was taken, ripped from the mouth of a world built on bones, bought with blood, baptized in fire. And the reckoning, it wasn't coming, it had already begun. The journey back across the border was a silence stitched with resolve, every footfall pressing deeper into the cracked skin of the earth, every step a vow. Free them all or die trying. He was no longer just a boy shaped by pain. He was a weapon, forged in the fires of suffering, tempered by loss, sharpened by rage. He moved like something more than human, an echo of the warriors who had resisted before him, from the Maroons of Jamaica to the rebel phalanxes of Angola to the ghost armies that rose and fell across centuries of slaughter. The blood of the Dahomey, whose female warriors fought with such ferocity that Napoleon's soldiers trembled at their approach. The spirit of the Mandinka, whose empires stretched across western Africa before European slavers carved up their kingdoms. The soul of the Fan people, who resisted colonization until their bodies broke, but their will remained unbroken. All this whispered in his veins. He was the ghost of every village set to flame, the retribution promised but never delivered. Until now, every breath he took was a declaration of war, every step a drumbeat of defiance. The trees shivered with it, the earth remembered it. The night itself wrapped around him like a second skin. He wasn't running from the world, he was coming for it. Before the dawn broke, Patwa and Ida found him. They were statues carved from willpower, faces set like storm-hardened cliffs. Patwa, older now, wore the weight of too many funerals in her eyes. She said nothing at first, just stood at his side, fierce and immovable as the mountains that had sheltered their Maroon community for generations. Ida knelt by the firelight, hands working in a rhythm older than language itself. She had spent days stitching a new armor from iron scraps and river clay, weaving it with the moss and bark of the swamps. Every stitch was a spell, every knot a curse hurled into the teeth of the empire. When she finished, she stood and draped the coat over his shoulders. It smelled of earth, of sweat, of survival. It made him something more than man, an extension of the land itself, a ghost born from the rot and rage of the South. The coat was reinforced with iron plates salvaged from the very shackles that had once bound their people, now hammered flat, purified by fire, and turned against their former wielders. Justice rendered in metal and blood. Patwa spoke then, her voice low, unshakable, the cadence of the old gods pounding through her words. No plantation, no master, no overseer, no slave patrolman, not their wives, not their children. None will sleep safe again. Inside him, something ancient shattered. The chains didn't just break, they exploded. The hunted had become the hunter, and the soil itself seemed to thirst for the blood that was coming. It was 1860. Lincoln had been elected, the 16th president of a nation tearing itself apart at the seams. Old Honest Abe, the rail splitter from Illinois, who spoke of halting slavery's spread but not ending it. A man of calculated compromise in a time that demanded moral clarity. To the enslaved, it was a flicker of hope in an ocean of betrayal. To the planters, it was the crack of doom. The Southern states, their wealth built on black backs, spat on the Union and tore themselves free, dripping hatred and treason in equal measure. South Carolina seceded first on December 20th, 1860, followed swiftly by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. The Confederacy was born in blood and fire, wrapped in false flags and Bible verses, claiming divine right to own other men. Before Lincoln could even lift a hand to the Bible at his March 4, 1861 inauguration, the land was already drunk on the promise of civil war. Militias formed across the South. Federal arsenals were seized. The drums of war thundered across America. But in Camarón they knew better. Freedom was never legislated. It was never gifted. It was stolen, bought in blood, paid for in bones. For every Frederick Douglass who spoke of liberation, there were 1,000 Nat Turners and Denmark Vessies who knew freedom came only through the edge of a blade. And he wasn't waiting for papers and politicians. He was marching north. For every whip crack, for every auction block, for every mother torn from her child, the reckoning had come. He moved like a phantom through the night, the swamp rising to meet him, hiding him, carrying him. Cypress knees parted like sentinels, allowing him passage while trapping his pursuers. The ground itself seemed to firm beneath his feet while turning to quicksand for those who hunted him. The swamp had not forgotten. It remembered the children torn from their mothers' arms at the auction blocks of New Orleans. It remembered the backs flayed open like butchered meat on the cotton plantations of Georgia. It remembered the women raped until their screams broke into silence in the rice fields of South Carolina. And now it moved with him, cloaking him in vengeance. Word of him spread faster than the newspapers could lie. The whites whispered of monsters in the dark, of creatures immune to bullets, of devils come to claim them. The name they gave him was Bigfoot, like the creature from frontier myths, a harmless story, a child's nightmare to frighten but not to truly fear. Much like they had diminished Toussaint Louverture's Haitian Revolution to slave unrest in their papers. They could not acknowledge what truly stalked them in the night. But the enslaved, they knew better. They lied. Every goddamn word printed in those southern newspapers bled poison and reeked of fear. The ink-told fantasies blamed the skunk ape, Mexican rebels raiding for gold, or just the devil's work in the night. Anything but him. They dared not print his name, not once, as if their silence could wash away the nightmare he carved into their empire of cotton and bone. They called him the Arkeme, the spirit of broken earth, who could not be chained, a name that slithered from Virginia to Texas on the breath of midnight, passed between blooded lips like a cursed gospel. The Arkeme is coming, be ready. The overseers heard it, too, in cotton fields gone suddenly silent. In the way eyes dropped, but shoulders straightened when whips cracked. In the restless rustle of fields at night that whispered of judgment coming due, Fairchild Plantation was first. Cotton Kingdom, hell on earth, 2,000 acres of Mississippi Delta transformed into profit through stolen lives and broken bodies. Eustace Fairchild ruled it, the breaker of men, the breeder of women, murder by law, and prophet, deacon on Sunday, devil by Monday, known for his correction house, where rebellious slaves were broken on the wheel of his sadism, where runaways had their Achilles tendons severed and were forced to crawl through fields as warnings to others. Him spent weeks studying the place, learning it like a vulture circles a dying beast, the patrol schedules, the weaknesses in the security, the rhythm of the overseer's rounds, the location of every slave cabin, every workhouse, every path that led to freedom. When he struck, it was without warning, without mercy. One by one, men vanished into the night, no noise but the wet crunch of finality. Throats slit with the precision of a surgeon. bodies hidden in the very cotton fields they had forced others to tend. He slipped through the overseer's quarters like a shadow through a graveyard. Just outside the big house, he found a girl chained to a tree. Wasting no time, he broke her chains and cut the rope binding her neck. Pressing a blade into her hand and pointing towards the forest, he urged her to run. She ran but straight towards the big house, sneaking into an unlocked back window. Colonel Augustus Green, veteran of Indian wars, killer of Choctaw women and children, woke to cold steel pressing against his throat. He reached for his pistol but found it already gone. "Remember, my sister," a voice whispered at his ear. "The one you said tried to run, the one whose baby you fed to the hounds." Words spoken by a house slave, the girl who had been chained to the tree, no older than 17, her name Nellie. Green died with her name caught in his throat, a plea centuries too late to matter. When he stepped into the master's house, Fairchild's blood had already baptized the floorboards. The old man died clutching a portrait of his grandfather, Major Isaac Fairchild, Jr., James Madison's brother-in-law. He was the first Fairchild to bring slaves to the region, laying the foundation of the family's fortune on shackles and suffering. He arrived with a Bible in one hand and a bullwhip in the other, preaching salvation while dealing in bondage. From stolen lives, he built an empire, brick by blood-stained brick, and passed down both the wealth and the evils that came with it. The fields burned, the mansion collapsed into its own ashes. The tools of torture, whips, chains, branding irons, and the cradles used to beat pregnant women were smashed and scattered like cursed relics. 200 souls melted into the night, guided by him toward Camarón and freedom. The myth exploded across the South. At Garland Plantation, the reckoning burned brighter. Morris Garland, grandson of a Charleston slave trader, son of a cotton baron, Harvard-educated, with a library of 3,000 books, he forbade his slaves from even touching. A man who boasted of his scientific management of human property, who wrote pamphlets defending slavery as a positive good for the African race. He studied phrenology, spotting nonsense, that African skulls were smaller, our minds dull. He measured skulls and kept meticulous records of his breeding program, who had sent his own children to the finest schools in Boston while denying even basic literacy to the enslaved. His brother-in-law, Captain Jeremiah Wilkes, of the newly formed Confederate cavalry, had brought 20 soldiers to protect the plantation, armed with Springfield rifles fresh from armories seized from federal arsenals. They patrolled the grounds day and night. These were men preparing for the war everyone knew was coming, drilling daily, stockpiling ammunition smuggled from northern factories, and even practicing artillery drills with a 6-pound cannon positioned to guard the main approach. But they weren't ready for what came in the night. He woke to the explosion, half his empire going up in flames. The cotton gin, the heart of his wealth, erupted in a fireball that turned night to day. He stumbled onto his veranda, blind with terror, firing into the darkness with a pearl-handled pistol, a gift from former President James Buchanan himself. The bullet hit him square in the chest, but the coat, Ida's bulletproof coat, stitched from scraps, blessed with rage, reinforced with the very iron that had once bound his people, held fast. The bullet flattened against it like a whisper against stone, and him walked forward, through smoke, through screens, through the ruins of a kingdom built on stolen lives. Behind him, Captain Wilkes rallied his men for a last stand, Confederate ammunition exploding in the burning storehouse like an unholy baptism. A newly freed man named Solomon engaged the captain in hand-to-hand combat, the blacksmith's hammer against the soldier's saber, metal screaming against metal like the souls of the damned. Garland's pistol clattered from his trembling hand as him lifted him by the throat, the master's feet dangling, kicking like a pig on a hook. "You think you're God," him growled, voice older than memory, deeper than graves. Garland's eyes bulged in horror as the realization hit him. This was no beast, no demon, but a man. A man carved from the same flesh his kind had brutalized for centuries. a man who had decided that the time for mercy had passed. Gods don't bleed, but you seem to think you're one of them? Let's see. And then the blade flashed. By late January 1861, the first 6 states had already seceded. Mississippi's declaration explicitly defended slavery as the greatest material interest of the world. In Charleston, the cadets of the Citadel fired on the Union supply ship Star of the West, the first shots of a war still unacknowledged. In Texas, Governor Sam Houston was forced from office for refusing to support secession. The South was transforming itself into the Confederacy, stockpiling weapons, manufacturing gunpowder, converting cotton mills to produce uniforms. Military academies accelerated graduation dates to provide officers for the coming conflict. Plantations were ordered to increase production to feed the armies being raised. But by the time the Confederate States were formally born in February 1861, with Jefferson Davis sworn in as president in Montgomery, Alabama, Hymns War was already raging. As they stockpiled ammunition in Columbia and Nashville, as they cast cannon in Richmond and Charleston, as they drilled fresh recruits in town squares across the South, the Arkeme moved through the shadows they cast. By the time the first artillery shells screamed over Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, marking the official start of the Civil War, Hymn had already freed over 800 souls and left 15 plantations smoldering in ash. The Confederacy found itself bleeding from within before the first official battle was joined. The price on his head would buy a small kingdom. $5,000 in Confederate gold, the equivalent of a plantation itself. The fear of his name emptied slave auction houses and sent cotton prices soaring as planters struggled to replace the workers who disappeared in his wake. The newspapers now called him a terroristic abolitionist, perhaps secretly funded by radical Republicans. Some claimed he was a white man in blackface, a Northern agent sent to destabilize the Southern economy. The slave patrols doubled, then tripled. Armed with fresh forged weapons meant for the Union front, they combed the swamps and forests. The border with Mexico was watched more closely than ever. Confederate cavalry units diverted from war preparations to hunt the phantom that led them from within. Confederate General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, preparing for the bombardment of Fort Sumter, cursed as he received reports of another plantation destroyed, more property liberated. Valuable cavalry that should have been training for war against the Union was instead hunting ghosts in the bayous. But they could not stop what was coming. No army could fight an enemy that moved like smoke, that struck like lightning, that melted away like morning mist. The Arkeme had risen, and with him a tide that would drown a world built on broken backs and stolen dreams. He moved like a hurricane through the night, unstoppable, unforgiving, leaving nothing but liberation and ash in his wake. Not just a man anymore, but vengeance reincarnated. Not just a rebel, but the embodiment of revolution itself. And somewhere in Washington, as Abraham Lincoln prepared to take the oath of office and face a nation tearing itself apart, the whispers reached him too of a ghost called the Arkeme, who was not waiting for no damn proclamations or permissions, who understood that freedom wasn't decreed by presidents or purchased through politics, but seized with blooded hands. He had already declared war, not with rifles or flags, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had seen too much and could bear no more. This war was older than him, older than his name, older even than the lie of freedom whispered at the nation's birth. America had sown centuries of suffering, scattering black bodies like seeds across blood-soaked soil. Now it would reap what it had sown. Not justice, not vengeance, but a reckoning, slow, unrelenting, and righteous. There could be no peace without memory, no future without the graves unearthed. And he would no longer bow to a history written in the language of the deceivers.
You've been listening to The Secret Story of Him from Enslaved to the Grave, the Man Who Freed More Slaves than Harriet Tubman. Chapter 16, The Arkeme. Before Lincoln was sworn in, He was already setting the South on fire. No laws, no speeches, just steel, smoke, and memory. One man, 15 plantations in ash, 800 souls freed. This ain't no benediction. It's the beginning of the end. Hardcover drops soon. Thank you for riding with us. Like, subscribe, turn on notifications. Comment, your voice is power. Tap in, chapter 17 is coming. Follow the link in the description. Support the mission. Cash App, My U Time.